Introduction. In the beginning of March 2016, I posted my first post in what would become the Gendernomics series on my blog blacklabellogic.com. It was not meant to turn into a running series, or to become the main subject on the blog that up until then had been mostly dedicated to philosophy and logic. However, as I was researching the post, doing the mathematics and making the graphs that would go along with it, I found it to be very enjoyable to write, and it became very well received. So, from then on I would mix in a post on Gendernomics every few weeks, usually prompted by conversations with other Twitter users, at blacklabellogic, or in the comments section. Alternatively, I would be reading management or economics literature, and find something that seemed like a good fit for an article. It is my belief that any man needs to know economics and business. Gendernomics was a good way to introduce men to economic concepts in the context of attempting to find a mate, or multiple mates, which is another field where men should strive for competence. This book represents an introduction to gendernomics, and for those unfamiliar with economics and business administration, an introduction to that field as well. The work of the manosphere is largely based on informal research and observations made by men in their pursuit of women in their daily life. Therefore, parts of it draws on conjecture, inference, and inductive logic, of which little scholarly research exists. Where I have found scientific research that supports the premises of the theories and comparisons I make in this book, they are cited and referenced in the bibliography. Some of these are direct sources, some of them represent literature that I have read as part of the research for this book. Both the manosphere and economics likes terminology and abbreviations. I have attempted to define the economic terms in the chapter where I first mention them, and have included a glossary of manosphere terms and abbreviations prior to the text itself. Glossary of terms and abbreviations. Alpha male, a sexually successful dominant male and the opposite of a beta male or average frustrated chump. Alpha fucks/beta bucks, AF/BF. The concept that female reproductive strategies tend to either default to males of high protector value, alpha, or high provider value, beta, average frustrated chump, AFC, a man with little sexual success who clings to any relationship he is able to obtain. Beta male, a sexually unsuccessful subservient male. Blue pill, viewing the world as one wishes it was. Epiphany phase, when a woman realizes that if she wants to settle down and have children she has limited time left to find a suitable mate. 28 to 35, hypergamy. The tendency of the human female to seek out men of higher sexual market value than themselves, and to seek to optimize short-term and long-term mating. Monogamy, a state of sexual monopoly by each of the participants in a relationship. Oneitis, a state in which a man views a woman as the exclusive option for him within the sexual marketplace. Party years, the time in a woman's life where her relationships with men are not focused on reproduction. Sexual marketplace, SMP, the human mating market. Sexual market value, SMV, the value of a person as a prospective mate. Sexual strategy, a plan or pattern of behavior designed to elicit more mating success. Social proof, evidence of a person's status within a social group, demonstrated by the manner in which members of a group respond to that person. Red pill, striving to view the world as it is. R/K selection theory, R/K, the trade-off between quality of offspring and quantity of offspring and the proportion of investment made in each unit of offspring. The wall, when a woman transitions from party years to the epiphany phase, and sees a drastic reduction in sexual market value. Defining the sexual marketplace. Economics as a field is in many ways as old our species. From our birth on this planet much of our lives have been spent focused on scarce resources. Food so that we can survive, shelter to shield us from the harsh outdoors, females so that we can reproduce and propagate our genes. Such a life brings hard choices. The best example in my mind is that of the Tyrannosaurus rex female who would defend her child to the death, yet should that child die in her effort to protect it, she will view it as little more than calories to replenish her body from the fight. Most people when they get their paycheck will divide it among food, shelter, clothing, entertainment, and other expenses, viewing some as necessities and others as discretionary expenses. There will always be alternative ways to spend hard-earned money, moving to a smaller apartment rather than a house, public transport rather than a car, and many other choices where we engage our inner economist. As a field, economics is often divided into macroeconomics and microeconomics, where macroeconomics deal with the aggregate of an industrial sector, a nation, or even the world as a whole, and microeconomics primarily focuses on individual businesses or at most sectors of industry. From this, it is clear that macro concerns itself with the big picture, how producers, consumers, and governments elect to spend their resources. Where microeconomics concerns itself with how businesses, individual citizens, and others elect to utilize their resources. A market is defined as a medium that allows buyers and sellers of a specific good or service to interact in order to facilitate an exchange. Sexual is defined as, of relating to or involving sex, of or relating to males and females. Thus, it follows that the sexual market is a medium that allows buyers and sellers of sex to interact in order to facilitate an exchange. This exchange does not have to be made in goods or currency, it could be in the form of various forms of bartering such as services as well. In fact, in many modern countries to exchange resources for sex directly is covered by legislation concerned with prostitution. If we approach the market from a historical perspective, it becomes quite clear that it facilitates an exchange of resources in some form, such as male protection and provision in exchange for female nurturing and fertility. Historically speaking, arranged marriages were the norm across large parts of the world, with the goal ranging from keeping resources within an ever-growing extended family to political networking. Such was and still is the case with many aristocratic families. The Borgia Pope, Rodrigo Borgia, utilized marriage as a way to cement support and aid to his reign as Pope, and set up his family to become a dominant and powerful force in Europe for hundreds of years after his death. 1. Another example would be the House of Medici, at one time the most powerful banking family in Europe, who through marriages into families such as Bardi, Salviati, Cavalcanti, and the Tornabuoni, in addition to many others, secured their position and ensured a steady stream of wealthy clients to their banking business. 2. For the agrarian human, an unmarried daughter was in many ways a drain on resources, as her contribution to the household of her father was dwarfed by the resources she consumed. The more unmarried daughters a man had, the worse of his sons who were to inherit his land would be, due to having to support their sisters for their lifetime as well. In essence, it became a case of expending resources on the current generation, which would negatively affect the future generation. If a man had only a daughter, and a lot of land, he could marry off his daughter to a neighbor's son where the neighbor also had a lot of land, and thus improve the future of both their families. This is still the norm within many cultures and countries at present. The Arabic world still operates largely with arranged marriages, often between various cousins. In India, parents continue to have an above-average influence on the marriages of their children, even expatriates to modern Western countries. 1. Only the Western world has given women the freedom to select their own partner to the furthest possible degree. The arranged marriages of old were about resources in various forms such as wealth, property, social position and many others. Even among the poor, marriages was a trait of the male's ability to protect the female and provide for her and the children. In exchange for the woman taking care of the house, which at that point was a full-time job, and giving birth to his children. In essence, the old sexual marketplace could be defined as an exchange of provision and security for the female, in exchange for reproduction and nurturing for the male and his children. The major change that has been introduced gradually over a few hundred years, and that has been happening much more rapidly as of the last 50 to 60, is that romantic love has taken center stage. 2. The introduction of modern romantic love into the sexual marketplace can be compared with the transition of a former communist economy to laissez-faire economics. A central body of planners tightly controls the former, the latter is one where market forces are relied upon to govern the market. A free market is one that is more responsive to market pressures and influences, whereas the latter seeks to eliminate such automatic responses with analytical and planned thought. From the historical perspective, the Central Planning Commission was the family of the two parties, who relied upon objective means to value a prospective partner for their child. The social position, wealth, upbringing, and various other merits were used to decide if something was a favorable or non-favorable union of families. A marriage was more than merely a union between a man and a woman. It was the union of two families into a joint venture. With the introduction of romantic love, the objective measures and concern for family were no longer relevant, and what was of importance was the highly questionable and subjective criteria of happiness. No methods truly exist to measure happiness in an objective manner or on an objective scale, thus it changed the market from operating on objective values to subjective values. 5. Therefore, with laissez-faire economics being applied to the sexual marketplace since the sexual revolution, rather than being a large market with simple rules and easy-to-evaluate value propositions, it has become highly diversified. As with every market, once more variables are introduced it becomes more difficult to predict, navigate and value the market. Furthermore, with the older sexual marketplace, a predictable set of behaviors existed for how persons interact within the marketplace, which added a sense of stability and control, which is now much more obscured. Where marriages used to be means to an end, that being provision, protection, procreation, cementation of power and position, or various other goals, the modern romantic marriage is viewed as an end in itself, where the relationship between the two are viewed as the end goal of the union, rather than a means to an objective end. 4. This naturally also affects the behavior of the market participants. Among others, it leads to despair and dissatisfaction when the union fails to be the ultimate step toward self-actualization. The sexual marketplace changes depending on where in the world and what community you are in. however similar principles apply to every market regardless of whether you are in Los Angeles, Las Palmas, or Lagos. The marketplace is open, however subjected to local prices and regulations, much like any other market. It also depends heavily on the actors involved, their goals, and their value perspectives. A market from a macro perspective is the result of the continuous interactions between actors within the marketplace. A good illustration is a stock market where prices are set through the continuous buying and selling of assets that determine the price based on supply, demand, and through various other means. In addition to the actors, there are regulations stemming from governing bodies, rules of trade by organizations, and social principles that influence the traders. It is assumed that actors are rational and utility maximizing, meaning that they have sets of preferences and seek to maximize their own benefit from engaging in trade. Thus, actors within the market and the various market frictions that affect trade determine how a market works. The macroeconomics of the sexual marketplace. Macroeconomics is the aggregate of microeconomics. While micro concerns itself with businesses, industries, and the choice of individuals, macro is focused on the entire economy, the world economy, and the likes. Concepts such as supply and demand, inflation and deflation, monetary policy, and value theory are central to macroeconomic theory and practice. These concepts help a person gain an understanding of how resources are allocated, measured, utilized, saved, invested, and consumed. Furthermore, which implications this has for him and those around him. Speaking of the sexual marketplace, the primary resource being consumed by both men and women is time. This resource is consumed in different ways by men and women. Men consume resources in either a productive way, increase in sexual market value, or a non-productive way, no increase or a decrease in sexual market value. Women consume time in that they have a limited time at their peak sexual market value and thus they must spend that time attempting to optimize hypergamy to the best of their abilities. 6. The field of macroeconomics focuses on how society allocates scarce resources according to its preferences, and the functions that are at play within the market. 7. At one of the more abstract levels, it concerns itself with investment, savings, and consumption within a society and the implications thereof. A society that invests heavily, electing to defer consumption will enable greater consumption later. A society that elects to consume a great majority of its resources may find itself facing a declining ability to consume as a result of lacking resource required to maintain production. A society which elects to save will stagnate, and often face a declining ability to consume. This follows from that investment creates future production, as it is assumed that investments will be in assets that have the potential to create return above that of the rate of return. For instance, electing to invest half of the value of your production in better and more means of production will increase production output. Every society has a minimum it must investment in order to maintain their current levels of production. This is referred to as replacement investment. However, by saving the value of the production, that which is saved does not contribute to new investment, as it takes the form of deferred consumption. This is similar to how a person, who puts his money in the bank, may earn a little interest, but this is no more than a compensation for the time value of money. Finally, by consuming everything one produces, one fails to keep up with replacement investment and thus one's ability to produce declines. Furthermore, as one does not save, the results are that future consumption becomes constrained because of a declining ability to produce with no savings that can be used to either consume or catch up on investment. Within markets, the laws of supply and demand control the price of a good. A common mistake is to assume that prices are a priori, but prices are the means through which supply and demand are balanced. The goal of supply and demand is to create an equilibrium where supply equals demand, and therefore resources are efficiently allocated. As economics views efficiency allocation of resources as the point where all demand is satisfied, with no goods going unsold. To this end, prices often taking the form of currency seeks to balance the quantity a supplier is willing to supply at a given price, with the quantity a consumer is willing to purchase at that price. This ensures efficient allocation of resources within the society through ensuring that there is no overproduction or underconsumption. The goal of supply and demand is to ensure that above-average returns do not exist for a long time, as this leads to non-efficient allocation of scarce resources. Concepts that exist within supply and demand are price elasticity, that is a way of figuring out the effect of price on supply and the effect of price on demand. Other factors that influence supply and demand are market frictions, monopolies, oligopolies, inflation, and deflation, all which will be covered later in this book. Various market failures can exist within a market that prevent the laws of supply and demand from attaining equilibrium. Some goods also interact with the laws of supply and demand in strange ways, such as Veblen goods and Giffen goods. A market can be tightly controlled by a central planning force, or it may be governed by market forces in what is themed a laissez-faire economy. In the former, everything is planned and the economy is governed by the few for the many. In the latter, it is governed by the many for the many according to the principles and mechanisms that have been observed by economists since Adam Smith. The problem of scarcity. Economics as a field exists to establish efficient allocation of scarce resources. If the world had unlimited resources, then economics as a field would not be required. If we go back a few 100,000 years to when humanity lived as hunters and gatherers, there were many life or death choices. Grog may only have had time to hunt or fish in one area, and if that area did not deliver a bounty of food, he and his family would perish. The goal of economics is to figure out, often through use of advanced mathematical models or the application of pure reason, how an individual, group or a collection of groups can get the maximum desired results available with their resources. In the case of Grog, for instance, if he could figure out how much of his time to spend hunting and how much time to spend fishing before hitting diminishing returns, he would earn the maximum benefit for his time. Many economic textbooks illustrate this with an example referred to as the guns versus butter model, where a nation has to choose between two options when spending finite resources. In this case, the nation has to decide which quantity of guns and butter best fulfills its needs. As illustrated by the graph of the production possibilities frontier. The graph shows which combinations of guns and butter are available. By following the graph, it is possible to see what the trade-off will be at a given level of production of one good. Producing more guns means less butter and vice versa. Within the sexual marketplace, this model has its application to establish the balance between self and other, for instance through determining what amount of your resources you wish to spend on a partner or partners and how much you wish to spend on yourself. The major difference is that while resources can be translated into time, and time is zero-sum, sex is not a zero-sum game, it is one without a hard limitation. Where the limitation comes is in the ability and resources available to men and women to obtain sexual encounters. Due to the performance burden, the man must divide his total time resources between the various endeavors he wishes to pursue. This takes the form of mutually exclusive choices, where the person must make a choice between door A and door B. However, efficiency also plays into the equation. The blue line in the chart can represent the old production possibilities frontier and the potential production possibilities frontier is represented by the red line. A society can become better at producing both guns and butter because of knowledge economies or economies of scale resulting from investment. If a society fails to reinvest, then the production possibilities frontier will shrink, thus meaning that its production will decline until zero unless additional investment is made. This takes place when a social preference for consumption becomes so widespread that reinvestment is not possible. At this point, consumption will be reduced by either choice or force. If a society invests more into its production, electing to consume less in the present in favor of consuming more in the future, the production possibilities frontier will move towards the right of the chart, enabling more consumption in the future. From a long-term perspective, putting off present consumption in order to have a higher consumption in the future is the better choice. However, in our present society, instant gratification has become the norm. Therefore, a man who is able to invest for the future is an outlier. He may garner untold benefits because of his ability to put off gratification. Time spent on current relationships versus new relationships. The simplest manner in which a man in a relationship experiences scarce resources is the choice between investing it in a single woman and investing it in potential new relationships. The beta strategy in such a case is to invest heavily in a single woman, even prior to the commencement of a sexual relationship. The alpha strategy is to spread his investment in a larger group of women. However, the total sum of investment is the same in terms of time. Thus, the alpha, through diversifying his investment, not only reduces his risk, he also creates a situation in which his investments naturally are in various relationship stages at any given time. This is a defense against scarcity in that it is unlikely that all these relationships will fail at the same time. This ensures that the alpha avoids a situation in which all his resources is invested in a single female, and thus creating a sunk cost problem or leaving him with nothing. By limiting himself to a single female, the beta is electing to consume all his resources now and make a singular investment in that one female. The reasoning behind this being a case of consumption rather than investment is that the investment is so great as to make a required return impossible when compensating for risk. This makes him highly vulnerable to sunk cost issues, in addition to other forms of bias. Time spent on different pursuits. Time spent on different pursuits can be an investment towards increasing the production possibilities frontier, resulting in a higher production in the future. The benefit of this is that it enables a higher consumption in the future because of deferred consumption in the present. For instance, the society outlined in the graph could elect to sell some of their guns or butter in the marketplace, and thereby obtain resources they could utilize to increase the production possibilities frontier and thus create a higher output of guns and butter later. A man, by putting off gratification and instead electing to spend his time in ways that improves his sexual market value, will enable himself to reach peak SMV once he reaches his mid to late 30s, and thus reach higher sexual market success. However, unproductive investments from an SMV perspective will not enable him to reach this peak. An unproductive investment from an SMV perspective is one that does not lead to an increased sexual market value or otherwise contribute to SMV success. Professional accomplishments, for instance, may lead to increased SMV through enabling more freedom, more income, or higher social status later. Becoming a D&D dungeon master, on the other hand, will not contribute to SMV, and thus from an SMP perspective is a case of either unproductive investment or pure consumption. Summary of investments, consumption, and saving. To maximize sexual market value, it follows that a man must defer his time consumption and elect to invest his time wisely. Time cannot be saved, which breaks this down even further, meaning that a man has two options: invest or consume. From a sexual marketplace perspective, any investment that does not increase SMV is unproductive. However, this will be a matter of perception. There are investments that can be made that do not appear to increase SMV that actually end up doing so on a longer time horizon. For instance, obsessively working on your career for a decade is not certain to bring you into the upper echelons of SMV for the first 5 years, but once you reach a high social position as a result of your career, that does influence your SMV. The important takeaway is to invest and consume only with careful deliberation and reasoning behind your actions. Time is the only zero-sum resource that exists within our world, and ensuring that you invest and consume yours in a manner that leads to maximum satisfaction is of paramount importance. The one regret in life is investing and consuming time in a manner that is proven as poor when viewed in retrospect. If you attain the maximum production possibilities frontier of your life, then you have as a byproduct lived a full life. Supply and demand in the sexual marketplace. Markets exist to allocate resources efficiently through pricing. Economics at the core is about efficient allocation. Markets are a means to that end and use price as a tool to ensure this. The goal of supply and demand is to establish an equilibrium between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, where supply equals demand and therefore, no resources are wasted. The law of supply states that if all else is equal, an increase in price will result in an increase in supply. This is a result of producers being willing to offer a higher quantity of a good at a higher price due to increased margins. The law of demand states that all else being equal, an increase in price will result in a decrease in quantity demanded. A decrease in price will result in an increase in quantity demanded. This is a result of more consumers being willing/able to purchase a good if the price decreases, but fewer being able/willing to purchase the good if the price increases. Some notable exceptions to this are substitute products. The demand for a product can be heavily affected by substitutes to that product. If, say, the price of bread goes up, but the price of pasta or rice goes down, then people are likely to switch over to an alternative source of carbohydrates. This is a consequence of utility maximizing consumers that elect to switch to an alternate product. Jiffin goods. Jiffin goods are an exception to classic supply and demand, and are goods that have an inverse relationship with price elasticity, in that they actually become more in demand as the price increases. Examples of such items are luxury goods, for instance high-quality watches, high-end cars, brand-name whiskey and Tom Ford suits. Veblen goods. Veblen goods are in a position where their high price is the source of their demand. These goods are positional, such as expensive watches, cars and jewelry. Thus, when their price goes down, the demand for goods of such a nature also goes down. If we look at population statistics, there are roughly as many females as there are males in the world. 2. In aggregate, there are more than enough women to go around, yet they have an appearance of scarcity, while men appear to be abundant. Some of this can easily be explained with statistics, such as those below from OkCupid. Graph 2 male age versus age of women he finds most attractive. Graph 3 female age versus age of men she finds most attractive. Statistically speaking, the sex ratio of the world is 101 men for every 100 females. 2. Something that would provide a basis for a scarcity mindset. This could be exacerbated by bias such as confirmation bias, framing effect, or base rate neglect. 3. The perception of scarcity can act as a driver of transactions within the sexual marketplace, resulting in suboptimal transactions. The appearance of scarcity drives men to attempt to close a deal prematurely, due to a fear of ending up alone. It is apparent from the sexual market curve that females will spend most of their formative years within the sexual marketplace in a steadily increasing value curve. This will result in females getting used to being of higher value than the equivalent male. As human beings have an innate tendency to project the future linearly from the past, it follows that they will expect their SMV to be steadily increasing. This perception is the reason for why a subset of women expects their equivalent male to remain partnership material for them, rather than preferring younger and more attractive women. Graph 4 Sexual Market Value Curve. As male SMV develops along a different curve than female SMV, they will grow to project their future as being the same as their present, thus it follows that they will have an expectancy of being valued lower than a female. This perception is a driver of poor decisions in the sexual marketplace, which in aggregate translates into the phenomenon called AF/BB within red pill circles. A woman subconsciously realizes that her sexual market value is in rapid decline and therefore moves to secure a long-term provider. A man, unable to believe how lucky he is that finally a woman wants to settle down with him, jumps on the suggested deal. This drives the average age of marriage, which takes place at 29 for men and 27 for women. 4. This secures the best deal for women, as despite coming off the peak SMV, they retain a large amount of their value, while the man has not yet experienced the rapid growth in his SMV that takes place after he turns 30. Thus, he makes a deal assuming that he will remain of the same value, but she will appreciate, while the opposite is the reality. 11. The average 29-year-old man is in the SMV position that a woman was in when she was 15 to 17, about to experience a rapid value growth, which will put him out of the league of a woman of equivalent age. The reality is that the woman's value will often depreciate after marriage, and usually this decline continues after having children, as few women regain their beauty after pregnancy, the associated years of caring for an infant and the additional burden added by another man's children on a new mate. 12. Further compounds this value decline. This represents not only an indication of her declining beauty, but also the toll a single birth or more have had on her. For the man, his social status and wealth will increase as he steadily builds more capital and reputation within his community. If he also takes care of his health, and does not fall into the dad bod trap, he may also increase his physical appeal as he ages for many years to come. For the female, however, her fertility drops dramatically after her early 30s, 13, so does her appearance, and thus her ability to lock down another male is reduced every year. Provided that both parties were of similar values when married, her SMV has perhaps declined by 3 points, while his has increased by 3 points, thus resulting in a 6-point SMV gap. The female, when re-entering the market at this point, is entering into a market where she faces more challenges than she has ever faced before. One must remember that the female has been a hot commodity virtually uninterrupted for 15 to 20 years at this point and therefore, knows no other world. This is the equivalent of a stock market trader re-entering the market of 2008, after retiring during the boom in early 2000. It is possible to make the argument that, as a group, a majority of men are all attracted to the same age group of women, as a result of being hardwired by nature to reproduce. 14. It follows that the demand for women of that group, such as the hot, young, blonde girl from earlier, is always stupendous. The demand for men on the other hand is equally distributed with age, thus resulting in the same aggregate demand, but in a different distribution. This is supported by the following graph based on data from OkCupid. Graph 3 Male age versus the age of the women he finds most attractive. This means that in any population 90% of men would be most attracted to the same 10% of women if age alone were used as a measure for female attractiveness. It follows that the competition within this segment of the sexual marketplace would be fierce. However, if we explore female attraction metrics on a macro scale, their preference for hypergamy, dating up, introduces a similar mechanic for females, where 90% of females are attracted to 10% of men. This is supported by the historical statistic that much larger amounts of females were able to reproduce than men. 15. This is a supply and demand conundrum if one ever existed. One where supply and demand are in equilibrium, yet there is no efficient resource allocation to be seen. The solution to the problem is to break down the market into several submarkets, which is the only way to solve this problem. If we merely wanted to pair off one man to one woman, then it follows that the market would be in equilibrium. However, as it is not, it becomes a question of preference rather than market failure. The determinants of supply are production costs, expectations of future prices and number of suppliers. The determinants of demand are income, tastes and preferences, prices of related goods and services, consumer expectations about future prices and incomes, number of potential consumers. If one assumes a controlled form of reproduction where one male and one female were assigned to one another, one would still not achieve 100% reproductive rates due to infertility, death in childbirth claiming both mother and child, and various other factors within the population. However, one would expect similar rates of reproduction between the two sexes. Thus, it follows that some men had harems, other men had no opportunity to reproduce. One can speculate as to why harems arose. Having many wives means that a man will have many children. Thus, he will have many daughters to marry to other kings or noblemen to secure support and many sons to act on his behalf. After all, one can have slightly more trust in family than in others. From the female perspective, why would one wish to pair with an angler or a bricklayer and live a hard life if one could marry a king and live a life of relative luxury? Marrying the king would also secure the future of her children, as they could marry other members of the upper class, or perhaps one day be kings themselves. The king and the nobleman in this case are an oligopoly, which leads to above-average returns. Whenever above-average profits are made within a sector or an industry, economic theory dictates that resources will flow into that sector until there is enough competition so that the returns become market-average returns. An oligopoly is a form of market failure that indicates stated or unstated collusion among strong actors in a market. For instance, if a country has 3 large